With Israel warning residents in Gaza of further military strikes today, the violence there really seems to be ramping up. When Palestinian terrorists, this is how it all started, kidnapped and killed 3 Israeli teenagers. The brutal attack certainly generated plenty of media coverage. The revenge killing of a Palestinian teenager was just as chilling and generated even more coverage, especially as hostilities escalated between Israel and the Hamas forces in Gaza.
3 bodies were discovered today in Israel and appear to be those of 3 Israeli teenagers kidnapped a little over 2 weeks ago.
The response by Israel was quick and powerful after 3 Israeli teenagers were found dead yesterday in the West Bank.
Tonight, Israel's military is bracing for more violence ahead of tomorrow's funeral for a Palestinian teenager. His murder sparked new fighting in Jerusalem.
Today, Mohammed's father took me to the street and showed me where his 17-year-old son, a Palestinian, was kidnapped before he was burned alive by suspected Jewish extremists.
Now to the escalating violence in the Middle East. Rockets falling on both sides of the border with the Gaza Strip and a possible ground invasion by Israeli troops looming.
Joining us now is one of the leading journalistic experts on the Middle East, The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg. Welcome.
Thank you.
So the New York Times, for example, did one front-page story on the killing of these Israeli kids who were coming home from religious school, and 3 front-page pieces on the equally horrible burning death of the Palestinian teenager. Do some in the media treat Palestinian deaths as somehow more newsworthy?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that you have 4 deaths, 3 Israelis and 1 Palestinian, got more coverage in the American media than a weekend in Chicago where 14 or 15 people were murdered. It's really astonishing how much we focus on the Middle East to start with. I think that there's probably some more surprise when Israeli vigilantes kill a Palestinian teenager. There was a kind of sick novelty to that. You don't hear about that often. You certainly hear about Palestinian terrorist attacks against Israelis on the West Bank. So maybe there was that as well. I don't know.
To your point, here's some headlines from recent days. Lead story, Washington Post, Israel hits Gaza homes, children and women killed. New York Times is one of the pieces I referred to, front page. Killing of Palestinian youth puts an Israeli focus on extremism.
Right.
So you're saying it's a more novel story?
Maybe. But I mean, look, obviously there is some, one of the things about this current war that we're having is it's totally fascinating to me how often headlines are written as Israel attacks Gaza sites and women and children are killed. The predicate act, the rockets that are coming from Gaza into Israel, perhaps because they're mostly being shot down, but perhaps because there is maybe some level of bias, that doesn't get covered in the same way. I'm very, very careful to not to ascribe bias in these. I think there's a kind of newsworthiness and novelty that sometimes people latch onto.
So you're saying Israel has more firepower, obviously, and it's inflicting more damage, obviously. And unfortunately, some civilians are dying despite the leafleting and warnings in advance. The Palestinian rockets are mostly getting shot down, and therefore the coverage looks beyond who started this conflict.
Well, I mean, I think, look, coverage generally of any conflict usually, starts 10 minutes before the event you're writing about, and so sometimes it would be useful for people to say, and I think here's a story that doesn't get written very much: is why, in fact, is Hamas firing rockets at Israeli civilians in the first place? Trying to understand what is their motivation, what is their goal, but we sort of write that off. We just assume that that's kind of part of the natural environment, and what's interesting is the Israeli response to those rockets.
You write about what you witnessed more than 2 decades ago when you were in the Israeli military police.
Yeah.
And how has that, talk a little bit about that and how that's affected your view today.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, this goes to this issue of double standards or higher standards. Look, I was shocked by some of the violence that I saw that was committed by some Israelis I served with, and I wrote about that in a book, and I brought that up to talk about this recent lynching of this Palestinian teenager.
I think we have some video of that, and this is a Palestinian-American teenager who was a cousin of the Palestinian who was killed.
Right, that's the beating.
Oh, the beating by Israeli police. We see it there.
It's awful. It's awful.
And how much does that affect the way Israel's perceived by the world media?
Look, this is why I'm careful to talk when I talk about bias, okay? Because on the one hand, there's obviously a double standard. There's actually a triple or quadruple standard. Israel's held to an impossible standard. The United States is held to an almost impossible standard. Palestinians are held to and certainly in the Arab world where there's huge amounts of violence, these countries are held to a lower standard by the media. Well, this goes to the core of the problem. One of the problems is that we ourselves hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I don't think there's anything wrong with holding Israel as a democracy as a Western democracy supported by the United States, to a higher standard.
Israel, for example, condemned the killing of the Palestinian
Well, they arrested
and made some arrests.
Right.
Hamas cheered the original slaying of those
What I would say is the way you judge a country is, okay, you're always going to have racists and violent hooligans in every country. The way you judge a country is how does the government of that country respond to those kind of acts. And so Israel, so far at least, has responded well to that. And so that's one way to judge it. But you have this essential problem where, on the one hand, you don't want Israel to be judged by a hypocritical double standard. 170,000 people have been killed in Syria. No one seems to care. Right. A teenager in the Palestinians gets killed and everybody cares. It's front page news. So you don't want to see that hypocrisy. On the other hand, I don't want to judge Israel by the standards of the neighborhood, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. These are pretty terrible places where human rights violations are rampant.
So bottom line, you do hold Israel to a higher standard because you think it holds itself to a higher standard when it comes to innocent civilians.
That is a very good way of putting it.
All right, well, I have to sum these things up because it's television. Jeffrey Goldberg, thanks very much for stopping by this Sunday.